Now, this is going to be basically one of our last groups of insects, and since this course was actually designed for students that had the major in that construction engineering management, we felt that one of the important things in here is to talk about how do you manage wood destroying insects that would attack buildings. And so in this lecture, what I want to do, this is the first lecture. We'll have the second lecture next week, and of course in the laboratory to finish it out. What I wanted to do here is talk about the biology of termites and sort of discuss why they're so effective at getting into our buildings and causing trouble, but also the nature of their attack. How do they get to the wood structures? And I think this is really important for us. If you have an understanding of that, then you can actually design buildings so that they don't have the ability to get into our buildings. To begin with, termites are merely one of many wood-destroying insects. Termites by far worldwide cause more damage to wood structures or structures made out of cellulose. Now, what would be other structures made out of cellulose other than just wood? We don't live in Asia. Give you a hint? Bamboo. We're beginning to use bamboo in flooring and other things, but in other countries, bamboo is the wood that they use. But that cellulose, termites can feed on those. There are other insects that either eat the wood. That would be things like powder post beetles, but there's also some longhorn beetles, flat-headed borers, and some weevils to do that. But then there's some other insects like carpenter ants and carpenter bees that actually use wood to build their nests. They don't actually eat the wood, but they use wood structures to build their nests, and if they have extensive enough activity, they can compromise that wood and make it unsuitable to be used for construction. Now, the termites themselves, remember that we used to call this the order Isoptera, but where are termites now? Do you remember? They're in the Blattera. We now consider them to be social cockroaches. But I've still got some of my termite friends that just can't believe that, but all the molecular genetic evidence indicates that. Remember, we talked about these before, that they are true social organisms. The term that we use is eusociality, and what that means is that they have a division of labor. They've got a sterile worker and soldier caste. Then they have a reproductive caste, which usually is kings and queens that are capable of producing, the kings are able of producing sperm, and the queens are able to producing eggs. Termites, unlike the ants and wasps, the social wasps, are also equal opportunity. We typically see workers that are male and female. We see soldiers that are male and female, and then the reproductives that are male and female. When it comes to the hymenopterous social insects, most of their society are all female. Now, in the United States, we have three types of termites. Our most common termite is the subterranean. And what do we mean by subterranean? We mean that the colony itself lives in the soil. But then the workers forage out of that colony to find cellulose, wood, in most instances, in order to feed on that. However, let's take a typical Ohio landscape. What would be other sources of cellulose other than the wooden structure of the building? Pardon? Okay, the trees. So many of the trees that have that little lawnmower nick on them or something like that and have created some heartwood rot on the inside of it, yeah, that's perfectly good material for termites. We spread wood all around the place in our landscape. Mulch, absolutely, especially wood chip mulch. We're just feeding the termites when we do that. A lot of people in my particular area are unaware that well-managed turf develops this nice little layer of what we call thatch. It's basically the undecomposed plant stems and leaves and material that's in there. Termites will eat that. That's perfectly fine. People use landscape timbers, and even though they say, well, they're treated wood, yeah, that treated wood, if you look at the label, says, well, this will last for 10 years. What happens after the 10 years? Well, the material that was inside of there has leached out. Now that cellulose is available, the termites can feed on that. There are two other types of termites that occur mainly in the southern areas. These are drywood termites and dampwood termites. If you live in Ohio, you're not going to have to deal with these. These are mainly tropical or semi-tropical species. They usually cannot withstand really cold winter temperatures. And what's interesting about these is that their entire colony will be within the wood itself. And so they don't need to have contact with the soil. They get their own moisture. These usually have thicker exoskeletons, and they make metabolic water and keep that metabolic water inside their colony. Now, the difference between these is, I think, pretty obvious. Drywood termites can get into what appears to be perfectly dry wood. Dampwood termites usually will only infest wood that is somewhere getting regularly moistened, either a broken flashing around a chimney or a leaking roof or something like that, especially down in Florida and the Gulf states. It's going to be highly attractive to something like dampwood termites. Remember that we separate the termites out by several features from ants. The termites have the straight antennae, the ants have elbowed antennae, the termites have the thorax broadly joined to the abdomen, while the ants have this narrow constriction between the thorax and the abdomen. When you get to the wing reproductives of these, or the swarmers, the ants have very small hind wings and large front wings, and more importantly, when they swarm, the ants have to take flight in order to mate. The termites, on the other hand, both the forewings and the hind wings are the same size and shape, being in a very long teardrop shape, and they often will drop those wings as soon as they emerge and begin to pair up. And so if what looks like flying ants has emerged in your house and there's a little collection of wings there, they're not ants, those are termites. As I indicated to you before, the drywood termites are primarily tropical and semi-tropical or subtropical in distribution. They usually are darker in color, and so you can see here a drywood termite has this darker pigmentation. What does that indicate to me? They have a thicker exoskeleton, which would be less permeable to water evaporating out of that. One of the interesting things about these, I find these all the time down in Florida, and what I'm looking for are these little tiny fecal pellets. They will periodically make a little exit holes out of their chambers in the wood, and they'll shove out their frass or fecal pellets, and these will often collect as little piles underneath. Here's what they look like. They're really kind of cute. They're quite small, but as you can see, they have this hexagonal sided shape to each of the frass pellets. Now, let's go back to the subterranean termite, and the reason why I want to go here is I wanted to show you one of the reasons why I think they're really good at being pests of cellulose or feeding on cellulose. And that's because while we talk about this different caste system, and what's they have got the workers, they've got the soldiers and the reproductives, they have a very plastic system, and it can be modified according to their needs. In essence, what happens, a termite colony, a subterranean termite colony, is initiated by a pair of winged swarmers. These winged swarmers are going to be called primary reproductives. They're going to have a hardened exoskeleton. Why? They had to leave the nest. They had to fly out into the environment find a new place to dig into the soil and start a new colony. So they expose themselves to the environment. They need a thick exoskeleton in order to survive that exposure from desiccation, sunlight, and so forth. Now, when those primary reproductives are successful in establishing a new colony, what the female will do, the female of this will then become the queen. And she will be the primary queen. Her consort, or the male, will stay with her. And they'll periodically mate, and they'll rear up the first brood. The first brood will be a worker caste. And notice the termite specialists screw this up. Do you see something wrong with this? They call the nymphs, or what we would call the nymphs, which are undifferentiated larvae. I don't like that term, but that's what they do. Now, why do they call it a larva? Well, that larva, depending on what pheromones or chemicals that are being manipulated in the colony, can turn into a worker. They can turn into a soldier. Now, the worker is, as you can see, is basically an immature form, but it is permanently immature unless the colony needs something. And if the colony needs something, a worker can transform into a soldier, or a worker can transform into a primary or secondary reproductive. Wow. So as you can see here, it's a very plastic kind of a system. Even though your worker, whatever the colony needs, if the colony needs more eggs to expand it, we can be modified into secondary reproductives. If the colony is large enough and sustainable enough, it can reproduce and produce new primary reproductives. Those would be the swarmers that leave that colony. And so, as you can see here, according to the colony needs, it can be very plastic. Now, here's just a picture of our eastern subterranean termite that lives here in Ohio. You're going to see here a whole bunch of workers. Now, what's the potential of all these workers? Well, all of these workers over here can remain as workers, basically chewing on wood, digesting that wood, regurgitating the digested products, and so forth. But if the colony needs more soldiers, they can transform into a soldier. If they need more reproductives, they can transform into reproductive. Now, what I do see here are two little ones. See one right there and one right there. Those would actually, in the parlance of a termite specialist, those would be larvae. Now, we do have a top expert on termites, and she actually rears large quantities of termites here, Dr. Susan Jones. And one day she called me in and said, "Dave, would you like to see one of my little initial colonies?" And we opened it up, and here was the primary reproductive. You can see here's the queen here. Now, that's not as big as those big African ones that you saw the video on. She's really only about an inch long, but as you can see, she's got a very distended abdomen. She can still kind of move around in there, but she's tended by these workers here that are feeding her, grooming her, and whenever she spews out eggs, they collect those eggs, take them over to another nursery area where they're allowed to hatch, and then the little early nymphs, what they call larvae, are then fed. But you can actually see her original consort, or this is the original male reproductive, and I can tell he's well fed. In there you can see he's got a nice fat abdomen, but it's not nearly as big or distended as hers. Here are some secondary reproductives. You can see these are ones that were, again, workers, but because maybe the primary reproductive had died or something else, they then became secondary reproductives, and these are called neotenics in the industry, but as you can see, they've gotten a little bit darker pigmentation. The abdomen is extended, but it's not nearly as extended as far as the primary reproductive. Their abdomens never get quite that large, but they are obviously bigger than a normal worker. Again, when a subterranean termite colony is large enough to undergo what I call the luxury of producing primary reproductives, those are going to be the swarmers. And here you can see, this is actually when I was at Penn State. We had a building where one of the, next to our entomology building, where one of the secretaries came over and said, these ants swarmed out in her office, and she was wondering, what to do about it. We took one look at it. Those aren't ants, those are termites. We went over, and the next day, in the windowsill, just outside where our office was, the termites swarmed again on the second day. I was able to get a picture of the swarmers. Most of the time when we do inspections of buildings for termites, what we're looking is that the termites have to go. Remember that they're living in the soil, but they have to go to the wood. And since they have no hardened exoskeleton, they're very prone to desiccation. So how do they get to the wood? They build what we just generically call mud tubes. Now, what are these mud tubes? You can see one right here. The tube actually, the ground was over here. They've actually come up through the cinder block here. They built the mud tube up here to get into the flooring. Now, we actually knocked a little piece of it off here, but there was a definite mud tube that went in there. What is this mud tube? Well, yeah, it is some dirt or soil or mud, but a lot of that is also just their fecal material. They build this, and what that does is allow them to have pretty much 100% relative humidity on the inside of those tubes, and so they can maintain themselves, get up to the wood, and begin feeding on that. They can build these mud tubes through any kind of crack or crevice, and here you can see a stuccoed wall that got a little crack in it, and you can just see this little sort of mud material in here, and again with a little ice pick, if you break that open, usually some termite nymphs will come tumbling out of there. So you know that it's not just mud that got splattered up in there, it's actually being used by the termites. Quite often, once the termites have gotten access to the wood structure, and they've built up a pretty good colony in there, they try to connect themselves again to the soil. And so there's what I call the stalactite mud tubes that sometimes hang down. That usually means you've got a pretty heavy infestation. They're just trying to make other connections with the soil so that they don't have to go so far to get to that area. As I indicated to you before, termite swarmers and swarming events usually occur outside, but occasionally they occur inside. When they occur inside of a building, that's usually, to me, about 100% certainty that they're in the wood of that building. When they swarm outside, that doesn't really mean that they're in the wood of the building. They may be using the mulch, they may be using a tree, they may be using something else as their cellulose source, but it does alert me that maybe I need to take a closer inspection of the building to make sure that they haven't gotten into the building. Now, how do they get into the building? And this is where we're going to get into some construction terminology and techniques in here. Now, this happens to be a building, looks like maybe a garage or an outbuilding that's built onto a slab construction. Now, slab construction merely means that I poured a concrete slab right here. On the outside of the slab, I've put in a footer, or a foundation footer, as this would call it. Now, why do I need that footer? Come on, construction people. Pardon? So my building doesn't fall down. Absolutely. I need that footer deep enough so that it can support the structure that's going to be put on top of it. And more importantly, if I'm in a zone that has a high water table, where that soil could liquefy, it needs to be deep enough to account for that. Or if I'm here in the north, that needs to be deep enough to allow for freezing and thawing or heaving of the soil. So that footer in most places up here is going to be maybe 3 to 4 feet down for that. Now, remember that the termites are living in the soil. So the termite colony is actually shown in here, down in here, but the termites are constantly sending out little exploratory tunnels and tubes. They're looking for cellulose. And so in this particular case, we can see in this picture that bad construction, the construction people said, you know, all this wood and stuff that we've got around here, let's just throw it down there and put concrete over the top of it. You're feeding termites that way. You're putting termite wood in contact with moisture and soil. They're going to love that. Now, how do the termites eventually get up to the wood structure? Remember that the wood structure, there should be a sill plate or a footer, a plate that goes right here, then the joist on top of that. So if there are little cracks and crevices, the termites can build their mud tubes up in here and go, woohoo, we found some cellulose. We've seen termites that will actually, remember that wherever there might be plumbing that goes through the concrete, there's always going to be little cracks or crevices around that. And of course the termites can come up there, build their little mud tubes until they find wood and get access. So there's many different kinds of accesses. Now in this one, they show a crack, but remember the cinder blocks are hollow. And you're not going to be able to see that. They're on the inside of that. They could get up to the sill plate, start working on the wood. You'd never know that they were there. Most termite people know a lot about building construction. And we'll talk about this in the laboratory next week. I'll show you some pictures of different types of construction techniques, all of which can either prevent termite infestations or exacerbate or allow termite infestations to occur. But typically, now I know all of this terminology because I get into legal cases. When I am in court, I need to know the difference between a joist, a post footing, and all the rest of the terms that are going on in these. Now, we don't have time to go through all of these, but what I wanted you to see is that these are the two primary types of construction that we have here in Ohio. Again, we'll go over these a little bit in the laboratory. We have very few what we would consider to be the slab on grade type. So slab construction is where you actually pour the concrete on top of a layer of gravel or something, but it's basically on the soil. Most of our construction here is with a basement or a crawl space underneath it. So I would have the foundation over here, again, deep enough to withstand whatever the environment is going to put into it. And in this particular case, this is a crawl space, but that could be a basement if I just raise that foundation up even further. Now, how can termites get to the wood? The wood's shown here by the joists that are in here, the sill plate that's on here, and the studs that are in here. Now, in this one, I've just got a sill plate and studs in here. How can the termites get in there? Well, on the inside, they could build mud tubes up to there. If I have a slab, there's always little cracks and crevices that can occur in where all those joints are. So how do I keep them out? And it's so simple. You probably didn't notice it, but there's a little piece of metal flashing shown right here. A little piece of metal flashing. Termites cannot chew through metal. Now, I find it interesting, where I grew up in Oklahoma. Oklahoma is designated federally as being a high-risk termite zone. Ohio, unfortunately, is designated a low-risk termite zone, though anybody that talks to the pest control industry says either through climate change or whatever, we probably really ought to be designated as a high risk. But basically, in those high-risk states, this flashing, this termite shield, as it's sometimes called, is required by law. It costs about $150 to treat a home that way. We don't have it here in Ohio. It's not required by law. It's not required by any municipalities. So if you're building a house, you can request it. And for like another $150, you can termite proof your house and never have that. Because, and I don't know if you noticed something a little odd about this, but this termite flashing yield in here, you can see that it's not shown here, but it should actually overhang on the inside and hang down on the outside. It should also hang, and the reason for that, if the termites build their mud tubes on the outside of that poured slab in there, they can't build their tubes around sort of a recurved hook, and so that's to keep them out in there. So, okay, we'll stop right there. We'll discuss this more next week and discuss some more details of some of these constructions that can exclude termites and make sure that you never have them.